Good afternoon. I'm Don Saba. I'm the director of Sierra Bioresearch, a company I founded over 30 years ago. What we do is biotechnology, chemistry, medicine, diagnosis. We study AIDS with the major drug companies. We study cancer with the major drug companies. And we've worked with veterinary concerns as well to try to find new diagnoses for disease. Now I'm going to tell you up front here that I have prepared a response to the isotopic studies that were reported by Dr. Smith and Dr. Riseborough. And on the advice of your executive director's office, they asked me to hold that off until agenda item 4. So I will be touching on that in agenda item 4. As for the moment right now, what I want to discuss is the many other sources of lead exposure in the environment. And that was hinted briefly when Dr. Riseborough spoke. As Mr. Canales mentioned, condors have a habit of seeking out non-food items, whether it's because they want to seek out calcium or whether it's for other reasons. That's a bit obscure. But the point being that they do seek out non-food items. And there are many non-food items out there in the environment that have been documented to be ingested by condors. We're talking nuts, bolts, screws, springs, PVC plastic, all of which contain lead. The washers and nuts and bolts, those are galvanized. They also contain zinc. And zinc as an impurity is part of the mix. So you've got lead and zinc. Now there's a syndrome called lead-zinc toxicity. And that's where you have both zinc toxicosis coincident with lead toxicosis. And what this does, it complicates the issue quite a bit because it's very difficult to distinguish between the two, between lead and zinc toxicity. So depending on the levels of lead or zinc in the blood, you may see a certain level of morbidity going on at a low level of lead or at a high level of lead, and a lot of that toxicity could be due to zinc. The reason I mention that is because most galvanized metals are predominantly zinc. Now, in that report, the ME report that Mr. Canales spoke of, he mentioned that, I don't know if he mentioned it, but I remember in that piece of work that at least one of those condor chicks died of zinc toxicity. Okay. Also, Dr. Riseborough alluded to the fact that he would be examining paint chips. The environment is full of paint chips. The industrial paints never phased out lead. Industrial paints still contain lead. Industrial paints are found on roadway markings, on roadway signs, on industrial buildings, on industrial equipment. Many sources of lead. Cattle on ranches will lick. They lick anything. They'll lick the paint on a post and get lead. If farmers or ranchers have burned old wood, old painted wood, that lead doesn't go away. That lead's right there on the ground. Cattle like to lick things. When cattle eat, they will pull up soil. Maybe 10% of their intake is soil containing lead, perhaps. Old oil spills from tractor equipment all contain lead. The bearings exude lead. Leaded gasoline contains lead. There are many sources of lead in the environment. Okay, I wanted to bring up another issue which I think might be something interesting. There is a genetic defect in which the ALAD gene can be defective. ALAD gene produces LAD enzyme, the delta aminolevulinic acid dehydratase enzyme, and this enzyme is a central enzyme that is measured to assess lead toxicosis. But if you have a genetic defect for that enzyme, you may be seeing levels of ALAD other than what you would expect for a normal individual, and you may be reading enzyme levels that would suggest lead toxicosis when in fact such is not the case. Now, this type of disease is very rare in human beings, very, very rare indeed. But it struck me that since the condor comes from a very limited genetic diversity stock, that at least I would ask the question, is anybody looking into this possibility of genetic defects? We all know what interbreeding will do. We've seen it in the royalty of England, what happens when you get interbreeding. Not recently, I mean in the past. I'm sorry. I don't mean any aspersions.
I'm sorry.
Royalty. What I mean was,
not because of your comment about the British monarchy, but you do need to summarize.
Yes. Okay. The other issue I wanted to bring forward, and I realize this is new, but I really think you want to be looking at this. I've looked quite a bit at the condor's range and how the condor is going out further and further. You've seen the GPS coordinates that show the range is going out further. Well, I've also been interested in chronic wasting disease. And this is a disease that is being approached now by the condor populations, particularly in Arizona. And my point about this is the following. Chronic wasting disease is mediated by a prion, a very tough protein molecule. You can't kill it by denaturation. It very likely will pass through the digestive tract of a condor. Imagine the condors in the northern Arizona region flying long distance, 50 miles an hour for how many hours? They could land in an area over there in Utah or Colorado, not that many hundred miles away, feed on a elk or deer that has died of chronic wasting disease, and then fly back home hundreds of miles away and defecate wherever they do defecate. Having passed the prion through their system, now you've seeded a new area with the chronic wasting disease prion. And not to be too graphic, but it is well known that when condors defecate, they do so on their legs. And therefore, these prions would be on their legs. And when they go to drink water, and I have seen pictures, it's actually quite entertaining, where a condor will set in a shallow muddy pool and flap its wings and dance around and have all kinds of fun, but his feet are in that muddy pool of water, and those prions are now in that water where big game such as elk or deer could feed. Now, chronic wasting disease is mediated by saliva to saliva transfer.
I'm sorry, you do have to summarize.
I was just about done.
Oh, thank you.
All I was going to say was simply that there is a mechanism for transmission, and I was going to ask, I'm phrasing this as a question, have you all, and that doesn't mean you all, but the commission, looked into the possibility of chronic wasting disease being transmitted by condors?
So in other words, the condor as a vector.
Indeed. And I will leave you with one thought, and that many vultures are thought to transmit anthrax in this very fashion.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for indulging me in a little bit of extra time.
Actually, it was quite entertaining. Thank you.
Thank you.